The night stretched longer than it should have. Amara laid on her back, staring at the ceiling, her body still while her mind refused to settle. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the city outside. Distant traffic, voices drifting up from the street, the occasional sound of something moving just out of sight. Normally, that kind of noise would have faded into the background. Tonight it didn't. Every sound felt sharper, more defined, like her senses hadn't quite returned to normal after everything that had happened. She shifted slightly, turning onto her side, pulling the blanket closer as if that might help her settle into something that resembled sleep. It didn't. The moment she closed her eyes, her thoughts circled back. The alley. The movement she still couldn't explain. Changho. The way they spoke as if she had already crossed a line she didn't know existed. Amara exhaled slowly and rolled onto her back again, pressing the heel of her hand lightly against her forehead. "This is ridiculous," she murmured. But the words didn't carry much weight, because it wasn't ridiculous. It was real. Her gaze drifted toward the window, where faint light from the city filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the room. For a moment she focused on that, on something simple, something familiar. Breathing in, breathing out, trying to convince her body that it was safe to relax. It worked just enough for her muscles to loosen, for her thoughts to quiet slightly. Not enough for sleep. Somewhere between one thought and the next, time slipped. Minutes blurred into something less defined, her awareness fading in and out without ever fully letting go. It wasn't rest. It wasn't wakefulness either. Just a quiet, restless space in between. Outside, the city shifted. The sounds changed gradually, the rhythm slowing before picking up again in a different way. Morning approached without asking permission, light beginning to press more insistently against the edges of the curtains. Amara blinked her eyes open, not entirely sure when she had closed them. For a second, she just lay there, disoriented in that soft transition between night and morning. Then it settled. Morning came too fast. Her body felt it immediately. The heaviness behind her eyes, the tension still sitting low in her chest, the lingering awareness that hadn't gone anywhere while she tried to sleep. Amara pushed herself up slowly, sitting on the edge of the bed as she let out a quiet breath. "Great," she muttered. She rubbed her face once, then let her hands fall to her lap, her gaze dropping briefly to her wrist. The bruise was still there, darker now, more defined. A small, quiet reminder that none of this had been imagined. Amara stared at it for a second longer than she meant to before standing, pushing herself into motion before her thoughts could settle back into the same loop. Routine. That's what she needed. Something normal. The shower helped. Not completely, but enough to ground her in something physical. The steady stream of water, the warmth, the repetition of familiar movements. It pulled her out of her head just enough to make everything feel manageable again. By the time she stepped out, dressed, and gathered her things, the edge of exhaustion had softened into something she could function through. Not gone, just contained. Amara grabbed her bag and paused briefly by the door, her hand resting against the handle as she took a slow breath. "Just a day," she said quietly. "That's it. Classes, people, movement, normal." She opened the door and stepped into the hallway. Campus felt different in the morning. Lighter, busier. The energy of it all more immediate, more alive in a way that made it easier to move without thinking too much. Students passed her in small groups, conversations easy and familiar, the smell of coffee drifting through the air as she made her way down the main path. Amara adjusted her bag on her shoulder, letting herself fall into the rhythm of it. Step, breathe, move forward. For a while it worked. She nodded when she needed to, responded when spoken to. Let the structure of the day carry her along without resistance. From the outside, nothing looked off. She moved like she belonged there, like everything was normal. But underneath it, that awareness hadn't left. It sat just beneath the surface, quiet but steady, like her instincts hadn't fully powered down. Every now and then, her attention would shift without warning. A glance over her shoulder. A pause half a second too long before turning a corner. Nothing was there. At least, nothing she could see. And yet, the feeling remained. Not as sharp as the night before, but present. She slowed slightly as she reached the edge of campus, her gaze drifting briefly across the street. People moved normally. Cars passed. The world continued without interruption. Nothing stood out. Amara exhaled softly and shook her head. "You're fine," she murmured under her breath. And maybe she was. Or maybe. She just hadn't seen it yet. She didn't sleep. The thought settled in, quiet and measured. She tried. Cross the distance unseen, his attention remained steady. But awareness doesn't fade once it settles in. Amara adjusted her grip on her bag and kept walking, her pace even, her focus forward. From the outside, nothing had changed. But something had. And whether she realized it yet or not, she was already moving differently. The next few days settled into something that almost felt like routine. Almost. Amara moved through her schedule the way she always had, classes, short walks between buildings, quick conversations with Raylan that filled the gaps in between. On the surface, nothing stood out. Nothing disrupted the flow of her day in a way that demanded attention. That was what made it harder to ignore. Because everything felt normal. And yet it wasn't. Professor Menjihun's class became the easiest place to focus. Not because it required less attention, but because it demanded more. He moved through discussions with a steady, controlled pace, asking questions that forced people to think past the obvious. It left less room for distraction, less space for her thoughts to drift somewhere else. Still, it happened. Amara would be halfway through a note, her pen moving across the page, when something in her awareness would shift. Subtle, quiet, just enough to pull her attention toward the window without thinking. Most of the time, there was nothing there. Just the street, students crossing, cars passing. Once, she noticed the same black car parked along the curb. It didn't stay long. By the time she looked again, it was gone. She told herself it didn't matter. People parked. People left. It wasn't unusual. And yet, the next day, her eyes went to the same spot without meaning to. The next few days settled into something that almost felt like routine. Almost. Amara moved through her schedule the way she always had, classes, short walks between buildings, quick conversations with Raylan that filled the gaps in between. On the surface, nothing stood out. Nothing disrupted the flow of her day in a way that demanded attention. That was what made it harder to ignore. Because everything felt normal. And yet it wasn't. Professor Menjihun's class became the easiest place to focus. Not because it required less attention, but because it demanded more. He moved through discussions with a steady, controlled pace, asking questions that forced people to think past the obvious. It left less room for distraction, less space for her thoughts to drift somewhere else. Still, it happened. Amara would be halfway through a note, her pen moving across the page, when something in her awareness would shift. Subtle, quiet, just enough to pull her attention toward the window without thinking. Most of the time, there was nothing there. Just the street, students crossing, cars passing. Once, she noticed the same black car parked along the curb. It didn't stay long. By the time she looked again, it was gone. She told herself it didn't matter. People parked. People left. It wasn't unusual. And yet, the next day, her eyes went to the same spot without meaning to.
She notices patterns faster than most. The observation came without urgency, steady and precise. That will either keep her alive, or pull her deeper. The thought lingered, measured and calm. She hasn't decided which yet.
Okay, you're doing it again. Amara blinked, her attention snapping back to the present. Raylan was watching her from across the table, one brow raised, her drink untouched. Doing what? Amara asked, though she already knew the answer. That thing where you disappear mid-conversation, Raylan said. You've been doing it all week. Amara exhaled softly, leaning back in her chair as she tried to reset her focus. I'm just tired. That's not what this is. It kind of is. Raylan tilted her head slightly, studying her. You've said that 3 times in the last 2 days. Amara huffed a quiet breath, glancing down at her hands before looking back up. It's just a lot at once. New place, new schedule. That I believe, Raylan said. But that's not all of it. Amara didn't respond. She didn't know how to explain something that didn't have a clear shape yet. So instead, she reached for her drink and took a slow sip, letting the conversation drift somewhere safer. Raylan let it go for now. The walks between classes became quieter. Not because the campus had changed, but because Amara had. She noticed more. The way certain paths felt different at certain times of day. The way some areas seemed to empty out just a little too quickly. The way her attention would shift without warning, pulling her focus to something she couldn't always identify. Sometimes it was nothing. A shadow moving in the wrong direction. A figure standing just a second longer than necessary before walking away. Other times, it was the feeling. That same quiet pressure she had first noticed in the alley. Not as strong. Not as immediate. But present. Lingering at the edges of her awareness like something testing the distance. Amara slowed once, her gaze moving over the space ahead of her. Students passed by, voices blending into the background, everything exactly as it should be. She stood there for a second longer than necessary, then shook her head and kept walking. Nights became something else entirely. Amara found herself drawn to the window more often than she wanted to admit, her gaze drifting out over the city as it shifted from day into something quieter, more layered. The ocean stretched out in the distance, dark and steady, reflecting just enough light to remind her it was there. It should have been calming. Sometimes it was. Other times, she caught herself watching the street below instead. The same stretch of road. The same passing cars. The same patterns repeating in ways she couldn't quite explain. Once, she thought she saw that same black car again. Parked. Still. Her attention sharpened immediately, her focus narrowing as she tried to confirm it. But by the time she leaned closer to the glass, it was gone. Amara frowned slightly, pulling back from the window. "You're reaching," she muttered under her breath. Maybe she was. Or maybe she was just starting to notice things she hadn't before. By the end of the week, the feeling hadn't gone away. It hadn't gotten stronger either. It had simply stayed. Steady. Consistent. Unwilling to be ignored. Amara adjusted her bag on her shoulder as she stepped onto the campus path, her pace slower now, more deliberate. Not hesitant. Aware. Her gaze moved briefly across the street, not searching, but not avoiding it either. Nothing stood out. Everything looked exactly the same. She let out a quiet breath and continued forward. From the outside, nothing had changed. Her routine held. Her schedule stayed intact. Her conversations remained easy enough to pass for normal. But underneath it, something was repeating. Something she hadn't fully caught yet. And the more she paid attention, the harder it became to pretend it wasn't there. By the end of the week, the feeling had become familiar enough that Amara stopped trying to ignore it. Not completely, but enough that she no longer brushed it off the second it surfaced. It came to her the way it always did. Quiet. Subtle. Just beneath the surface of her awareness. Not tied to a sound or a movement she could point to, but something she felt before she could explain it. She noticed it as she stepped off the main campus path, her pace slowing without her meaning to. The walkway ahead was less crowded this time of day, the usual rush thinning into scattered movement. Students passed in small groups, conversations low, footsteps steady against the pavement. Nothing about the scene demanded attention. And still, something didn't fit. Amara came to a stop, her weight shifting slightly as she let her gaze move across the space in front of her. Not searching, just observing. Behind her, the campus continued its normal rhythm. Voices carried, doors opened and closed, footsteps passed without hesitation. When she turned, everything looked exactly the way it should. No one stood still. No one lingered. No one watched. At least, not in a way that could be easily named. Amara held her position for a second longer, then let her focus soften instead of sharpening. It was easier that way. Taking everything in at once instead of trying to lock onto one thing and forcing it to make sense. That was when she saw it. Not clearly. Not directly. But enough. A figure near the edge of the walkway, partially obscured by the movement around him. He wasn't doing anything that would stand out on its own. He wasn't staring, wasn't approaching, wasn't making himself obvious. But he wasn't moving the way everyone else was either. He stood a second too long, turned a fraction too late, watched without looking like he was watching. Amara's chest tightened slightly, but she didn't react. She didn't stare. She didn't let her attention lock in a way that would give anything away. She simply noted it, then turned forward again. Her pulse picked up just enough to remind her this wasn't something she had imagined. This was real, and it was happening more than once. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder and started walking again, her pace steady, unchanged from before. But now, she was paying attention. The awareness stayed with her as she moved, not pressing, not urgent, just present enough to keep her from slipping back into distraction. She passed the spot where she had seen the figure, her gaze shifting briefly without lingering. He wasn't there anymore. Or he had moved. She couldn't tell which. Amara kept walking. Her thoughts moved more carefully now, more deliberately as she sorted through what she actually knew. Not assumptions. Not guesses. Just what she had seen. The same car appearing more than once. The same feeling in places that should have felt normal. And now, someone who didn't move like everyone else around him. That wasn't coincidence. That was pattern. She reached the edge of campus and slowed again, her gaze drifting across the street. Traffic moved normally. People crossed at the light. Nothing stood out in a way that demanded attention. And still, that same awareness lingered. Not behind her this time. Not to the side. Just present. Like something had shifted from watching her to waiting. Amara tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to sharpen her focus. "You're not as subtle as you think," she murmured under her breath. The words weren't meant for anyone to hear. They were simply acknowledgement. She straightened and stepped forward, crossing the street without hesitation. Her pace remained steady, her posture relaxed, her expression neutral to anyone who might glance her way. From the outside, nothing had changed. But internally, something had. She wasn't avoiding it anymore. She wasn't pretending it wasn't there. And whatever had been watching would notice that. Amara didn't look back as she reached the other side. She didn't need to, because for the first time, she wasn't the only one aware of what was happening.
Changho had noticed her before she ever realized she was being watched. Not because she stood out in any obvious way. She didn't draw attention to herself, didn't move like she was trying to be seen. From a distance, she blended into the rhythm of the city as easily as anyone else. That was the problem. People who didn't belong in his world usually felt out of place the moment they crossed into it. There was hesitation, confusion, a natural instinct to retreat from something they didn't understand. She hadn't done that. Not in the alley. He could still see it clearly. The narrow stretch of concrete. The shift in the air just before everything changed. The rogue stepping in too close, too confident for someone who had already made a mistake. Changho had been there first. Watching. Measuring. Waiting to see how far it would go before he needed to step in. It should have been simple. Contain the situation. Remove the threat. Leave no trace. That was how it always worked. Until she turned the corner. She hadn't hesitated. Not the way she should have. Not the way anyone else would have. She had stopped, yes, but not frozen. Not panicked. Her awareness had sharpened almost immediately, her attention shifting in a way that told him she understood something was wrong, even if she couldn't define it yet. And when the rogue grabbed her, Changho's control had slipped. Not visibly. Not in a way anyone else would have recognized. But it had shifted. Because the moment his hand touched her, everything in him reacted. Not to the threat. To her. The memory tightened something in his chest, subtle but persistent. He ignored it. The way he had been ignoring it since that night. From his position now, just outside the flow of campus traffic, Changho's gaze tracked her movements without following too closely. She had changed. That much was clear. Her pace was the same. Her posture steady. Anyone watching without knowing what to look for would see nothing unusual. But he wasn't anyone. She paused more now. Not long. Just enough. Her attention shifted without warning, her awareness catching on things that didn't fully reveal themselves. She was noticing patterns. Faster than she should have. That alone made her a problem. She stopped near the edge of the walkway. Changho stilled. Not physically, his stance didn't change, his breathing even, but his focus sharpened as her movement broke rhythm. She turned. Not searching. Observing. It was subtle. Controlled. Too controlled for someone who was supposed to be unaware. His jaw tightened slightly. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was learning. When she turned back and continued walking, he adjusted his position without drawing attention, moving through the space in a way that kept distance while maintaining line of sight. No one noticed. No one ever did. That was the point. He had intended to keep it that way. Distance. Observation. Containment. That was all she was supposed to be. But the closer he got, the harder it became to ignore. It wasn't constant. That would have been easier to dismiss. It came in flashes. Brief. Sharp. Unwanted. The awareness of her presence settling under his skin in a way that had nothing to do with strategy or control. He noticed the way she moved before he meant to. The shift in her expression when she thought no one was looking. The way her attention sharpened when something didn't sit right. And every time, something in him responded. Immediate. Instinctive. Unacceptable. Changho slowed slightly as she reached the street, his gaze narrowing just enough to track the shift in her posture. She had stopped avoiding it completely now. That was new. Dangerous. And entirely predictable. She spoke. Too quiet for anyone else to hear. Not for him. You're not as subtle as you think. The words carried just enough to reach him. Changho stilled. Not outwardly, but internally. Something shifted. There it was again. That reaction. Sharp. Uncontrolled for a fraction of a second. His attention locked more fully onto her, his focus tightening in a way that had nothing to do with the environment around them. She wasn't guessing anymore. She was acknowledging it. Acknowledging him. That should have been enough to shut this down. To end it before it escalated further. Before it became something harder to manage. Instead, he moved. The distance between them closed quickly, but not abruptly. His steps were measured, deliberate, each one placed without hesitation as he crossed into her space like it had already been decided. Because it had. He stopped in front of her, close enough now that the shift in the air was unmistakable. Her awareness sharpened immediately. Good. She should feel it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Changho studied her without masking it this time, his gaze moving over her in a way that was no longer just observational. It was assessing, confirming, testing something he had no interest in naming. The bond pressed again. Subtle. Persistent. Unwanted. He ignored it. You've stopped pretending you don't notice. His voice was calm. Even. Like nothing about this interaction had changed. Her gaze held his, steady despite the tension that had settled between them. I was never pretending, she replied. Another shift. Small. But there. Changho's jaw tightened slightly, his attention sharpening as something in her response settled deeper than it should have. She wasn't lying. That was the problem. You're paying attention now, he said. Not a question. Should I not be? She asked. The correct answer would have been yes. The correct response would have been to reinforce distance. To shut this down. Instead, he said nothing for a moment, his gaze holding hers as the pressure of it built quietly between them. Because the truth was already obvious. She was in it, whether she understood it or not, whether he allowed it or not, and something in him had already responded. That was the part he refused to acknowledge. You're making this harder than it needs to be. The words came measured, controlled, but there was a sharper edge beneath them now. Not directed at her. At the situation. Her expression shifted slightly. You keep saying things like that without explaining anything. Because you don't need the explanation. Her frustration was immediate, visible in the way her posture tightened just slightly. That's not how that works. No, he said evenly. That's exactly how it works. The bond pressed again. Stronger this time. Changho stepped back, not retreating, resetting distance. Control. His gaze moved briefly past her, scanning the space beyond in a way that had nothing to do with her anymore. But everything to do with what could happen next. She's already been seen. Han's voice echoed in his memory. She saw enough. Changho's expression didn't change. But the decision had already been made. When his attention returned to her, it was sharper. Final. You stay where you're supposed to be, he said. And you stop looking for things you don't understand. And if I don't? She asked. The question lingered. For a second longer than necessary. Changho held her gaze. And this time, he didn't soften the answer. Then you won't like what finds you first. Silence settled between them. Not empty. Just heavy. He didn't wait for her response. Didn't give her time to push further. Because this wasn't a conversation he was willing to let continue. Not like this. Not now. Changho turned and walked away. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Because the problem wasn't whether she would follow. It was that. He already knew she wouldn't stop. And worse. He wasn't sure he wanted her to.
By the start of the following week, Amara had stopped second-guessing herself. Not completely, but enough that she no longer dismissed the feeling the moment it surfaced. It had become something she worked around instead. Something she accounted for. Monday moved like any other day. Classes, conversations, movement between buildings. The steady rhythm of campus life carried on without interruption, and for the most part, she followed it easily. But underneath that, she paid attention, not in a way that drew attention to herself. She didn't stop randomly, didn't stare too long, didn't make it obvious she was looking for anything. She just noticed. The way certain areas felt quieter than they should. The way her awareness would sharpen without warning. The way something in her shifted before she could explain why. By the time evening settled in, the air felt different. Cooler. Quieter. The kind of quiet that didn't come from a lack of people, but from something else. Something harder to define. Amara adjusted her bag on her shoulder as she stepped off the main campus path, her route taking her along a quieter stretch that led back toward her dorm. She had walked this way before. More than once. It had never felt like this. She slowed. Not abruptly. Just enough to let her awareness catch up with her movement. There it was again. Stronger now. Closer. Amara's gaze shifted slightly, not searching, just taking in the space around her. The path stretched ahead, dimly lit by scattered streetlights. A few people passed in the distance, their voices low, their movements unremarkable. Nothing stood out. And yet, something was there. She stopped. This time, intentionally. Her weight settled evenly as she turned her head just enough to glance behind her. Empty. At least it looked that way. Amara exhaled slowly, her pulse steady but alert. Okay, she murmured under her breath. Not imagining it. A step echoed behind her. Not loud. Not rushed. Just deliberate. Amara turned. He wasn't trying to hide. That was the first thing she noticed. He stood a few feet back along the path, just inside the edge of the light. Tall, relaxed, his posture loose in a way that felt intentional rather than casual. His presence hit differently. Not like Changho. Not like Han. This felt off. His head tilted slightly as his gaze settled on her, a faint smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. Yeah, he said, voice low, almost conversational. You felt that, didn't you? Amara didn't answer right away. She studied him instead, her attention sharpening as her instincts lined up with what she was seeing. He wasn't trying to blend in. He wasn't trying to control the space. He was enjoying it. That depends, she said evenly. Was I supposed to? The smile widened just slightly. Most people don't, he said. They walk right past it. Amara's shoulders stayed relaxed, but her stance shifted just enough to ground her. I'm not most people. No, he agreed, his gaze flicking over her in a way that felt more invasive than observational. You're not. The air tightened. Not gradually. All at once. Amara felt it immediately. That pressure. Stronger now, heavier, like the space around them had shifted into something more confined. Her pulse picked up, but she didn't step back. Not yet. You've been busy, he continued, taking a slow step forward. Walking around like you belong here. I do belong here, Amara replied. He huffed a quiet laugh. Yeah, he said. That's the problem. Another step. Closer now. Too close. Amara held her ground, even as every instinct told her this was different. This wasn't observation. This wasn't warning. This was something else. What do you want? She asked. His gaze sharpened, the amusement fading just enough to reveal something colder underneath. Just trying to figure out what makes you worth the attention, he said. The words landed wrong. Not confusing. Not vague. Clear. And intentional. Amara's jaw tightened slightly. Then you're wasting your time. He smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. Maybe, he said. Or maybe you just don't know what you stepped into yet. The pressure shifted again. Closer. Tighter. Amara took a slow breath, her awareness narrowing as the space around her seemed to pull inward. She knew this feeling now. But this was stronger. Less controlled. You should go, she said, her voice steady. Raven's head tilted again, studying her in a way that felt more curious than concerned. And miss this? He asked quietly. Not a chance. He moved again. Not rushed, but faster than before. Amara reacted this time, stepping back as the distance between them closed too quickly. Her pulse spiked, her focus sharpening as the tension snapped into something real. This wasn't watching anymore. This was a problem. And for the first time, it wasn't waiting.
The shift happened before Raven reached her. Amara felt it first. Not the same way she had felt him, sharp, invasive, pressing too close, but something heavier, quieter. The kind of presence that didn't push into the space so much as take control of it. The air tightened, then stilled. Raven stopped. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden movement. No visible reaction that would stand out to anyone else. But he stopped. Mid-step. Amara noticed the change immediately. The way his posture adjusted just slightly. The way the edge in his expression flattened, not disappearing, but recalibrating. Her pulse didn't slow, but her focus shifted, because she recognized this feeling. Footsteps approached from behind her. Measured, unhurried, certain. Amara didn't turn right away. She didn't need to. She already knew. Changho stepped into the edge of her peripheral vision before coming fully into view, moving past her just enough to place himself between her and Raven without making a show of it. The motion was clean, intentional, like it had already been decided before it happened. For a moment, no one spoke. Changho's presence settled into the space with quiet finality, his posture relaxed, his expression unchanged. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than a man stepping into a conversation. But nothing about it felt casual. Raven's gaze shifted to him, the faint smile from earlier still there, but thinner now. "Didn't think you'd show up this fast," he said. Changho didn't respond immediately. His attention moved over the space, once not lingering, not searching, just confirming. When his gaze settled on Raven, it was steady, unmoved. "You're done here." The words were quiet, even, delivered without emphasis. Raven let out a soft breath that almost resembled a laugh, though it didn't quite reach that point. "That's not really your call," he said. Changho didn't react. Not outwardly. He didn't step forward, didn't raise his voice, didn't shift his stance in any obvious way. And yet, something changed. Amara felt it. Not a surge. Not pressure. Just certainty. The kind that didn't need to be announced. Raven felt it too. That much was clear. His posture tightened, just enough to give it away, his gaze narrowing slightly as he held Changho's. For a second, it looked like he might push it, might test the boundary. Changho didn't move. Didn't give him anything to push against. "I said," he repeated just as evenly, "you're done here." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It held. Heavy. Unavoidable. Raven exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to signal the shift. Not submission. Not agreement. But acknowledgement. "Yeah," he said after a second, glancing past Changho toward Amara before his attention returned. "You always were like that." Changho didn't respond. He didn't need to. Raven held his gaze a moment longer, then gave a slight shake of his head, something almost amused flickering across his expression. "This isn't over," he added, his tone lighter now, but no less pointed. "No," Changho said calmly. "It is." Another pause. Shorter this time. Raven studied him, as if weighing something that had already been decided. Then he stepped back. Once. Twice. Creating distance. His gaze flicked to Amara one last time, something unreadable passing through his expression before he turned and walked away. No rush. No hesitation. Just a quiet exit that felt less like retreat, and more like a pause. The space shifted again the moment he was gone. Not lighter. Just different. Amara exhaled slowly, her body catching up to the tension it had been holding. Her focus moved to Changho. He hadn't turned around yet. He stood exactly where he had stopped, his posture unchanged, his attention still fixed on the direction Raven had gone. "Watching." "You knew he was here," she said. Changho didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was the same as before. Calm. Controlled. "Yes." Amara frowned slightly. "And you were just going to let that happen?" That got a reaction. Small. But there. Changho turned then, his gaze settling on her with the same steady focus as before. "I didn't let anything happen," he said. "That didn't look like nothing," she replied. "It wasn't." The answer came without hesitation. Amara held his gaze, her frustration threading through the tension that hadn't fully left her system. "Then what was it?" Changho studied her for a moment, his attention more deliberate now, more focused in a way that made it clear he wasn't just observing anymore. He was deciding something. "Control," he said. The word landed simply, but it carried weight. Amara let out a quiet breath, shaking her head slightly. "That didn't feel very controlled." "It was," he replied. "You just weren't part of it." That didn't help. Amara crossed her arms slightly, grounding herself as the frustration settled in. "You keep saying things like that like I'm supposed to just accept it." "You don't have to accept it," Changho said evenly. "You just have to understand it. And how am I supposed to do that if no one tells me anything?" A pause. Changho's gaze held hers, steady and unreadable, but there was something else beneath it now. Something more focused than before. "You don't," he said. Amara stared at him. "That's not an answer." It's the only one you're getting right now. The tension between them held for a moment, not as sharp as before, but no less present. Amara exhaled slowly, her thoughts catching on the one thing she couldn't ignore. He wasn't like you, she said. Changho didn't ask what she meant. He felt. She hesitated, searching for the word. Different. He is, Changho said. That wasn't reassuring. Amara's gaze narrowed slightly. Is that supposed to make me feel better? No. At least he was honest. Silence settled again, quieter this time. Not empty. Just unresolved. Changho's attention shifted briefly past her, scanning the space once more before returning. When he spoke again, his tone hadn't changed. But the meaning had. You shouldn't be walking alone right now. Amara let out a short breath. You keep saying that like I have a choice. You do. And if I don't listen? Changho held her gaze for a second longer this time. Then I won't always get there first. The words settled between them. Not a threat. A fact. Amara felt it. That difference again. And somehow, that made it worse. Changho stepped back slightly, creating space between them. Not leaving. Just resetting the distance. Go back, he said. Amara didn't argue this time. Not because she agreed, but because something in the moment told her pushing further wouldn't get her anything she didn't already know. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder, her gaze lingering on him for just a second longer before she turned. As she walked away, her pace steady, her posture controlled, she didn't look back. But this time, she knew exactly what was behind her. And for the first time, she knew it mattered.
The walk back felt different. Not because the campus had changed, or because anything around her stood out in a way it hadn't before. People still moved through the pathways in small groups. Conversations carried. Lights flickered on as the evening settled deeper into night. Everything continued exactly as it should. But Amara didn't experience it the same way anymore. She walked with a steady pace, her bag resting against her side, her focus forward. Not distracted. Not uncertain. Just aware. Tension from earlier hadn't fully left her body. It lingered in quieter ways now, settling into something less immediate but more permanent. Her thoughts moved more carefully, turning over what had just happened piece by piece, trying to make sense of something that refused to fit into anything familiar. Raven. The way he moved. The way he spoke. The way the space had changed the moment he decided not to wait anymore. And then, Changho. Amara exhaled slowly as she reached her building, pushing through the doors and stepping into the quieter interior of the dorm. The shift from outside to inside was immediate. The noise softened, the lighting steadied, everything returning to something that should have felt normal. It didn't. Not completely. She made her way upstairs without rushing, her steps even, her attention still turning over the same moments. You're done here. You stay where you're supposed to be. You won't like what finds you first. They weren't threats. That was the part that stuck with her. They weren't said with anger, or urgency, or anything that felt reactive. They were said like facts, like outcomes that had already been decided. Amara reached her door and stepped inside, closing it behind her with a quiet click. For a moment, she just stood there, listening. Nothing followed. No sound outside the door. No shift in the air. No presence pressing at the edges of her awareness. The silence felt complete. And yet, it didn't feel empty. Amara moved further into the room, setting her bag down before crossing toward the window. The city stretched out below her, the night fully settled now, lights reflecting across the distance in steady lines. She had stood here before, looked out at the same view, tried to convince herself that everything was still simple. It wasn't. Her gaze dropped briefly to her wrist again. The bruise had darkened further, more defined now, impossible to ignore even if she wanted to. A small mark, but it had started all of this. Amara lifted her hand slightly, turning her wrist just enough to study it before letting it fall back to her side. Her thoughts shifted, not scattered, not uncertain, clearer now than they had been all week. This wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't something she could walk away from just by pretending it didn't exist. She had been seen. The realization settled in quietly, without resistance. Not dramatic. Not overwhelming. Just true. Amara leaned back against the edge of the window, her arms folding loosely as she looked out over the city again. For a brief moment, she considered what it would mean to step back, to follow the instructions she had been given. Stay on campus. Stop paying attention. Let whatever this was exist outside of her world. It would be easier, safer. But that option had already passed. Not because she couldn't take it, because she wouldn't. Her jaw tightened slightly, something steadier settling beneath the tension that hadn't fully left her. Not fear, not confusion. Decision. If I'm already in it, she said quietly, her voice steady in the stillness of the room, then I'm not staying in the dark. The words didn't feel reckless. They felt necessary. Outside, a car passed slowly along the street below, its headlights cutting briefly across the building before disappearing again. Amara's gaze followed it for a second, her attention sharpening without her meaning to. For just a moment, the feeling returned. Not strong, not immediate, but present. Amara stilled, her focus narrowing slightly as she watched the street below, her instincts catching on something she couldn't quite see. Nothing stood out. Everything looked normal. And still, the awareness lingered. She exhaled slowly and stepped back from the window, pulling the curtain just enough to break her direct line of sight. Not to block it, just to create space. Because now she understood something she hadn't before. This wasn't about whether something was there. It was about whether she could see it yet. Amara turned away from the window and moved toward the bed, the room settling back into quiet around her. From the outside, nothing had changed. The same room, the same space, the same version of her life she had stepped into when she arrived in Busan. But underneath it, everything had shifted. She wasn't standing on the outside anymore. And whatever this was, wasn't waiting for her to catch up.